This is Audible.
The New York City Draft Riots of 1863, the history of the notorious insurrection at the height of the Civil War. Written by Charles River editors. Narrated by Scott Clem. Introduction. Martial law ought to be proclaimed, but I have not a sufficient force to enforce it. Major General John E. Wool, Commander of the Department of the East. Most adults alive today either remember or have heard of the turbulent 1960s, but far fewer are familiar with the similarities those more recent protests had with the earlier unrest of a century earlier. Although the Civil War is remembered as the seminal event of American history, and it is often portrayed as the Lincoln administration and the North fighting bravely to preserve the Union and ultimately end slavery, the truth at the time was far more complicated. Perhaps most notably, as with Vietnam, the Civil War was very unpopular among many in the North, especially in large manufacturing cities that were dependent on the South for raw materials. Also, as African Americans made their way north in the hopes of making new lives for themselves, they often encountered racism and outright violence. Native-born Americans and newly arrived immigrants alike often resented black men taking jobs they felt were theirs by right, and in the wake of the Emancipation Proclamation, many men were hesitant to fight on behalf of a cause that they saw as being for the benefit of blacks. With the Civil War still raging and no end in sight, the Lincoln administration instituted the first conscription laws in the North in 1863, and it led quickly to an outbreak of violence in New York City and other large cities. In fact, the New York City Draft Riots, which lasted several days in July of that year, still stand today as the bloodiest and deadliest in American history. More than 100 people died during the week of July 12th through 18th, as mobs of thousands looted and burned buildings across the city in protest. However, in addition to targeting the draft, people also attacked African American men, women, and children, and anyone who might try to defend them. It's been estimated that over a dozen blacks were lynched across the city during the unrest, and thousands of people were injured. Ultimately, the city's police department was forced to call in forces from all around, including a number of battle-weary soldiers who had just fought a few weeks earlier at Gettysburg, to put down what seemed to be moving toward a new insurrection. In the end, the authorities were able to stop the violence, but the heavy price paid by the city's newest black citizens would tarnish race relations in that area for another century. The New York City Draft Riots of 1863, the history of the notorious insurrection at the height of the Civil War, chronicles the controversial violence that wreaked havoc across New York City in the summer of 1863. In this audiobook, you will learn about the New York City Draft Riots like never before. Chapter 1. Inflammatory Attacks on the Draft Law. In the month preceding the July 1863 lottery, in a pattern similar to the 1834 anti-abolition riots, anti-war newspaper editors published inflammatory attacks on the draft law aimed at inciting the white working class. They criticized the federal government's intrusion into local affairs on behalf of the nigger war. Democratic Party leaders raised the specter of a New York deluged with Southern blacks in the aftermath of the Emancipation Proclamation. White workers compared their value unfavorably to that of Southern slaves, stating that, "We are sold for $300, the price of exemption from war service, whilst they pay $1,000 for Negroes." In the midst of wartime economic distress, they believed that their political leverage and economic status was rapidly declining as blacks appeared to be gaining power. On Saturday, July 11, 1863, the first lottery of the conscription law was held. For 24 hours, the city remained quiet. On Monday, July 13, 1863, between 6 and 7 a.m., the 5 days of mayhem and bloodshed that would be known as the Civil War Draft Riots began. Leslie M. Harris, In the Shadow of Slavery, African Americans in New York City, 1626 to 1863, 2003. After the Union debacle at the Battle of Fredericksburg in December 1862, the fighting in the Eastern Theater of the Civil War for that year was done, and the decisive Confederate victory buoyed the Confederacy's hopes. Confederate Commander Robert E. Lee was described by the Charleston Mercury as jubilant, almost off balance, and seemingly desirous of embracing everyone who calls on him. The results of Antietam and the Maryland campaign from 3 months earlier, a strategic defeat for the Confederate Army of Northern Virginia that forced Lee's retreat out of the North and allowed Lincoln to issue the Emancipation Proclamation, were apparently old news or forgotten by the Mercury, which boasted, "General Lee knows his business, and the Army has yet known no such word as fail." Naturally, Fredericksburg represented one of the low points of the Civil War for the North, with the Army of the Potomac having suffered an almost unheard-of 8-to-1 ratio in losses compared to Lee's army. Lincoln reacted to the news by writing, "If there is a worse place than hell, I am in it." It showed, too, as noted by Pennsylvania Governor Andrew Curtin, who told Lincoln after touring the battlefield, "It was not a battle, it was a butchery." Curtin noted the president was heartbroken at the recital and soon reached a state of nervous excitement bordering on insanity. Meanwhile, radical Republicans, frustrated at the prosecution of the war, took it out on the generals and the Lincoln administration. Michigan Senator Zachariah Chandler claimed, "The president is a weak man, too weak for the occasion, and those fool or traitor generals are wasting time and yet more precious blood in indecisive battles and delays." Perhaps the Cincinnati commercial summed up the battle best in reporting, "It can hardly be in human nature for men to show more valor or generals to manifest less judgment than were perceptible on our side that day." Although there was jubilant talk in the South of the North giving up the fight imminently after Fredericksburg, it was clearly premature. Lee had concluded an incredibly successful year for the Confederates in the East, but the South was still struggling. The Confederate forces in the West had failed to win a major battle, suffering defeat at places like Shiloh in Tennessee and across the Mississippi River. As the war continued into 1863, the Southern economy continued to deteriorate. Southern armies were suffering serious deficiencies of nearly all supplies as the Union blockade continued to be effective at stopping most international commerce with the Confederacy. Moreover, the prospect of Great Britain or France recognizing the Confederacy had been all but eliminated by the Emancipation Proclamation. Given the unlikelihood of forcing the North's capitulation, the Confederacy's main hope for victory was to win some decisive victory or hope that Abraham Lincoln would lose his re-election bid in 1864, and that the new president would want to negotiate peace with the Confederacy. Understandably, this colored Confederate war strategy, and unquestionably Lee's in 1863, which goes a long way toward explaining why the Confederate leader was so aggressive at Chancellorsville in May and Gettysburg in July. Ironically, two of the biggest turning points of the Civil War for the North occurred less than 2 weeks before the New York City Draft Riots at Gettysburg and Vicksburg. But at the beginning of the year, the Union's leaders and supporters knew full well how tenuous things were. The problems were particularly acute in New York City, one of the largest centers of commerce in the nation, and as a manufacturing town, New York City depended on Southern cotton for its textile factories. Unable to get the materials it needed during a state of war, many of its factories were standing idle and its men thrown out of work. Among those out of work were a large number of European immigrants who had come to the land of opportunity only to find there was none. To make matters worse, the war had brought an influx of African Americans into the city, giving rise to the feeling that they were somehow responsible for taking away the jobs. Thus, when Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation went into effect on January 1, 1863, it was interpreted by many as making the war primarily about freeing the slaves in the rebellious states. This added fuel to the fire of discontent, as the white citizens of the city felt they and their family members were dying for the very people that were taking their jobs and or competing with them for already scarce jobs. Against this backdrop, the stage was set for an eruption of violence, and all that was needed was something to set it off. That came in March 1863 with the passage of the Enrollment Act, the first time Americans were ever involuntarily drafted into military service. On top of that, those who could afford it could pay $300 to hire another man to serve for them, and since African Americans were not considered citizens as a result of the Dred Scott decision, they were exempt from the draft as well. James B. Fry, Provost Marshal General, described the scene and the results when the draft was implemented in New York City in early July 1863. The several deputies received official requisitions direct from the president, calling for specified numbers of men, and were instructed to commence operations on the 9th of July. In compliance with this order, Provost Marshal Jenkins, of the 9th Congressional District in New York, publicly announced through the press that on Saturday the 11th, the ballots would be publicly counted at the corner of 46th Street and 3rd Avenue, and that immediately thereafter the wheel would be turned and the draft begin. Rumors of popular dissatisfaction were heard on every side, trouble was apprehended, and the police were notified to hold themselves in readiness for any emergency. On Saturday morning, a large crowd assembled at the appointed place, but as everything was conducted quietly, systematically, and fairly, no opportunity for disturbance occurred. The day passed pleasantly. The crowd were in good humor. Well-known names were saluted with cheers, and at night, as the superintendent of the police passed out from the office, he remarked that there was no danger to be apprehended. The Rubicon was passed, and all would go well. The names of the conscripts were published by the press of Sunday morning, with incidents, jocular and otherwise, connected with the proceedings. In the neighborhood in which the initial working of the law was attempted, an excitable element of the city's population resided. Very many poor men were, by the turn of the wheel, forced instantly, as it were, from home and comfort, wrested from the support of a needy family, to be sent they knew not whither, perhaps to the battlefield, or perhaps to the grave. Such were the apprehensions of many imprudent persons, who were liable to the draft, and such their anxieties for the fate of their wives and children, that associations were formed to resist it, at the last alternative, with bloodshed. Chapter 2. The Mob in New York. The mob in New York. Resistance to the draft, rioting and bloodshed, conscription offices sacked and burned, private dwellings pillaged and fired, an armory and a hotel destroyed, colored people assaulted, an unoffending black man hung, the Tribune office attacked, the colored orphan asylum ransacked and burned, other outrages and incidents, a day of infamy and disgrace. The New York Times, July 14, 1863. In the wake of the implementation of the draft on Saturday the 11th, the New York Times reported, the initiation of the draft on Saturday in the 9th Congressional District was characterized by so much order and good feeling as to well-nigh dispel the forebodings of tumult and violence which many entertained in connection with the enforcement of the conscription in this city. However, the New York City Police Department was particularly short-staffed in fighting the mob since the state militia, which would normally back them up in a time of crisis, had been sent to Pennsylvania earlier in the month to fight in the Battle of Gettysburg. As the New York Times put it on the 14th, very few, then, were prepared for the riotous demonstrations which yesterday, from 10 in the morning until late at night, prevailed almost unchecked in our streets. The authorities had counted upon more or less resistance to this measure of the government after the draft was completed, and the conscripts were prepared to take their place in the ranks, and at that time they would have been fully prepared to meet it. But no one anticipated resistance at so early a stage in the execution of the law, and, consequently, both the city and national authorities were totally unprepared to meet it. The abettors of the riot knew this, and in it they saw their opportunity. We say abettors of the riot, for it is abundantly manifest that the whole affair was concocted on Sunday last by a few wire pullers, who, after they saw the ball fairly in motion yesterday morning, prudently kept in the background. When the time came for the second drawing to be held the following Monday, July 13th, fighting immediately broke out. 500 men, following the lead of the Black Joke Volunteer Fireman Brigade, Engine Company 33, attacked the office of the Provost Marshal, where the draft was being drawn. The men picked up some of the stones used to pave the streets in front of the office and threw them through the windows. They also broke down the building's doors and set the place on fire. The New York Times reported on the 14th, the number of men who thus started out in their career of violence and blood did not probably at first exceed 70. Scarcely had 24 names been called when a crowd, numbering perhaps 500, suddenly made an eruption in front of the building, corner of 3rd Avenue and 46th Street, attacking it with clubs, stones, brickbats, and other missiles. The upper part of the building was occupied by families who were terrified beyond measure at the smashing of the windows, doors, and furniture. Following these missiles, the mob rushed furiously into the office on the first floor, where the draft was going on, seizing the books, papers, records, lists, and all of which they destroyed, except those contained in a large iron safe. The drafting officers were set upon with stones and clubs, and with the reporters for the press and others, had to make a hasty exit through the rear. They did not escape scatheless, however, as one of the enrolling officers was struck a savage blow with a stone, which will probably result fatally, and several others were injured. When John Kennedy, the police superintendent, visited the scene of the first altercations on Monday, he was attacked by the mob and badly beaten despite not being in uniform. His men also attempted to stop the riots, but were quickly overpowered. The Times vividly described that attack. Soon after the rioting began, Superintendent Kennedy hurried to the scene in a carriage, and as he alighted, a portion of the crowd recognized him, greeting him at first with uncomplimentary epithets and afterwards with blows. A score or more of the ruffians fell upon him and dealt heavy blows upon his head, face, and body, injuring him severely. They doubtless would have killed him outright had not a strapping fellow in the crowd felt some compunction at the brutality of the rest and dashed into the rescue. By vigorous blows, he kept a clear space about Mr. Kennedy's prostrate body until 2 policemen gathered up their chief and removed him to a place of safety. Fry quickly contacted Colonel Robert Nugent, then the acting assistant provost marshal general for New York City, telling him, "Go to General Wool for force, if you have not done so, to quell the riot reported in 3rd Avenue, provided it is serious. You had better concentrate your invalid corps with other forces and act directly against the rioters, in conjunction with the city police. I have telegraphed General Wool. Report conditions of affairs." To Major General Wool, who commanded the forces in the Department of the East for the Union, Fry wrote, "Adjutant General Sprague, now here, informs me that Colonel Henry L. Lansing at New Dorp has 300 or 400 men available for the riot, and also 2 companies under Major George W. Scott on Rikers Island. General Sprague says these are all subject to your orders. The Marines and sailors at the Navy Yard and receiving ship will, I presume, cooperate, if applied to by you." Martha Derby Perry was busy caring for her husband, John, who had broken his leg while serving as an Army surgeon, when she heard a commotion. She later described the scene. "On the first day of the riot, in the early morning, I heard loud and continued cheers at the head of the street, and supposed it must be news of some great victory. In considerable excitement, I hurried downstairs to hear particulars, but soon found that the shouts came from the rioters who were on the way to work. About noon that same day, we became aware of a confused roar. As it increased, I flew to my window and saw rushing up Lexington Avenue, within a few paces of our house, a great mob of men, women, and children. I drew the cot upon which John was lying, his injured leg in a plaster cast, up to the window, and threw his military coat over his shoulders, utterly conscious of the fact that if the shoulder straps had been noticed by the rioters, they would have shot him. So blind was their fury against the army. The mass of humanity soon passed, setting fire to several houses quite near us, for no other reason, we heard afterward, than that a policeman, whom they suddenly saw and chased, ran inside one of the gates, hoping to find refuge. The poor man was almost beaten to death, and the house, with those adjoining, burned. At all points fires burst forth, and that night the city was illuminated by them. I counted from the roof of our house 5 fires just about us." Perry was one of the few people to know about the riot right away, because the rioters cut the telegraph lines in the area to keep word of the problems getting out. They also dismantled fire trucks and streetcars, even killing some of the horses that pulled them. As the day wore on, Edward S. Sanford of the U.S. Military Telegraph Service sent increasingly frantic messages to Washington, reporting the riot's progression and pleading for help. The first, sent to Secretary of War Edwin Stanton just after noon, read, "What is represented as a serious riot is now taking place on 3rd Avenue at the Provost Marshal's office. The office is said to have been burned and the adjoining block to be on fire. Our wires in that direction have all been torn down. A report just in says the regulars from the Governor's Island have been ordered to the vicinity." 2 hours later, Sanford telegraphed again, this time insisting, "The riot has assumed serious proportions and is entirely beyond the control of the police. Superintendent Kennedy is badly injured. So far, the rioters have everything their own way. They are estimated at from 30,000 to 40,000. I am inclined to think from 2,000 to 3,000 are actually engaged. Appearances indicate an organized attempt to take advantage of the absence of military force." When the mob reached 44th Street, the members stormed the Bull's Head Hotel and demanded drinks. When the owner refused to serve them, they burned the building down. Soon, word went out to nearby forces that the situation in New York City was getting out of hand. James B. Fry, Provost Marshal General, wrote to Major General John E. Wool, who commanded the Army forces in New York City, for clarification. "Sir, it is reported that a serious riot is in progress in 3rd Avenue, and that the Provost Marshal's office has been burned. Will you please furnish at once all the force you can to enforce the Enrollment Act, provided the necessity for it is as represented?" For his part, Wool later reported, "In the afternoon of the 13th, but Brigadier General Harvey Brown, in the immediate command of the United States troops in the forts, excepting Fort Columbus, presented himself and volunteered his services, expressing a willingness to serve in any capacity, in the emergency then pressing upon us. I accepted his offer and directed him to report to Major General Sanford, who was then in the immediate command of the troops, with Colonel Nugent, however, under him, in command of the United States portion of the troops, all the troops then out being mixed, of militia and regulars. Immediately after receiving my instructions, General Brown took his position at Police Headquarters, 300 Mulberry Street, so as to be in immediate communication with the police authorities, and I appointed 2 of my aides to assist him. I soon after learned, however, that in the disposition and management of the troops there existed a want of harmony between Generals Sanford and Brown, in consequence of which I issued the following order, sending a copy to each. Gentlemen, it is indispensable to collect your troops not stationed and have them divided into suitable parties, with a due proportion of the police to each, and to patrol in such parts of the city as may be in the greatest danger from the rioters. This ought to be done as soon as practicable. Wool soon faced a problem in that his own men were refusing to obey his orders, so he had to change his tactics. He informed those under his command, all the troops called out for the protection of the city are placed under the command of Major General Sanford, whose orders they will implicitly obey. Wool also sent a number of telegrams to Washington and elsewhere asking for help in putting down the riots. He warned Rear Admiral Hiram Paulding, "There is a riot in the city in opposition to the draft, which threatens to be quite serious. I have ordered all the troops in the ports in this harbor to report to Colonel Nugent, Acting Assistant Provost Marshal General, number 106 Leonard Street, New York City, but in all they amount to only a small band. Can you not furnish us with a company or more of Marines for that purpose? By aiding us at this moment, you will confer a favor on the city authorities as well as myself." Later in the day, Wool contacted Paulding again, this time in a near panic. "I hope you will be able to furnish a small armed steamer to guard the arsenal on Governor's Island as required within by Major Robert A. Wainwright. I have ordered all the troops on Governor's Island to this city. Furnish such a steamer if you possibly can. If you cannot send a steamer, send your sailors, which you mentioned to my aide-de-camp, to the island with howitzers." His concern was well-founded, for had the rioters been able to arm themselves with the guns from the nearby arsenal, they would have likely been unstoppable. The New York Times noted a tense standoff outside of one armory. At about 4 o'clock, the crowd proceeded from the scene of their exploits in Lexington Avenue and 44th Street to the armory situated on the corner of 2nd Avenue and 21st Street. The building was a large 4-story one and was occupied for the manufacture of rifles and carbines for the government. In the early part of the day, the police authorities had placed in the building a large number of policemen, consisting principally of the Broadway squad. Their instructions were to protect the building and the property therein, and to resist with force any attempt of the invaders to enter the premises. The mob on 2nd Avenue, 21st and 22nd Streets rapidly increased, and at the time the first attempt was made to force the doors of the building. It amounted to from 3,000 to 4,000, the greater part of whom were boys. At this time some 18 or 20 men, followed by scores of youngsters, made an attempt to force the doors of the armory on 21st Street. The doors were burst open by means of heavy sledges, and the crowd made a rush to enter the building. Those in charge of the building, acting under instructions, fired upon those who were entering, and 4 or 5 were wounded. One man, named Michael Vaney, was shot through the heart and died immediately. Vaney was a mechanic and worked in the Morgan Iron Works. He was about 40 years of age and resided in 23rd Street between Avenues A and B. The other persons who were shot are not regarded as being seriously injured. One of the most egregious attacks perpetrated during the riots took place on that first day of unrest when a large mob attacked some of the most helpless in the city. A report explained, "It is well known that as soon as the Bull's Head Hotel had been attacked by the mob, their next destination was the Colored Orphan Asylum on 5th Avenue near 43rd Street. The crowd had swelled to an immense number at this locality and went professionally to work in order to destroy the building, and, at the same time, to make appropriation of anything of value by which they might aggrandize themselves. About 400 entered the house at the time, and immediately proceeded to pitch out beds, chairs, tables, and every species of furniture, which were eagerly seized by the crowd below and carried off. When all was taken, the house was then set on fire, and shared the fate of the others. While the rioters were clamoring for admittance at the front door, the matron and superintendent were quietly and rapidly conducting the children out of the backyard, down to the police station. They remained there until Thursday. The burning of the asylum occurred on Monday, July 13th, when they were all removed in safety to Blackwell's Island, where they still remain. There were 230 children between the ages of 4 and 12 years in the home at the time of the riot. In her history on blacks' experience in New York City from the 17th to 19th centuries, Leslie M. Harris noted, "The rioters' targets initially included only military and governmental buildings, symbols of the unfairness of the draft. Mobs attacked only those individuals who interfered with their actions. But by afternoon of the first day, some of the rioters had turned to attacks on black people and on things symbolic of black political, economic, and social power. Rioters attacked a black fruit vendor and a 9-year-old boy at the corner of Broadway and Chambers Street, before moving to the Colored Orphan Asylum on Fifth Avenue between 43rd and 44th Streets. By the spring of 1863, the managers had built a home large enough to house over 200 children. Financially stable and well-stocked with food, clothing, and other provisions, the four-story orphanage at its location on Fifth Avenue and 42nd Street was an imposing symbol of white charity toward blacks and black upward mobility. At 4 p.m. on July 13th, the children, numbering 233, were quietly seated in their schoolrooms, playing in the nursery, or reclining on a sickbed in the hospital when an infuriated mob, consisting of several thousand men, women, and children, armed with clubs, brickbats, etc., advanced upon the institution. The crowd took as much of the bedding, clothing, food, and other transportable articles as they could and set fire to the building. John Decker, chief engineer of the fire department, was on hand, but firefighters were unable to save the building. The destruction took 20 minutes. Harris explained how the racism had actually been simmering for the years and merely bubbled to the surface when given the opportunity. Throughout the week of riots, mobs harassed and sometimes killed blacks and their supporters and destroyed their property. Rioters burned the home of Abby Hopper Gibbons, prison reformer and daughter of abolitionist Isaac Hopper. They also attacked white amalgamationists, such as Ann Derrickson and Ann Martin, two women who were married to black men, and Mary Burke, a white prostitute who catered to black men. Near the docks, tensions that had been brewing since the mid-1850s between white longshoremen and black workers boiled over. As recently as March of 1863, white employers had hired blacks as longshoremen, with whom Irishmen refused to work. An Irish mob then attacked 200 blacks who were working on the docks, while other rioters went into the streets in search of all the Negro porters, cartmen, and laborers they could find. They were routed by the police. But in July 1863, white longshoremen took advantage of the chaos of the draft riots to attempt to remove all evidence of a black and interracial social life from areas near the docks. White dock workers attacked and destroyed brothels, dance halls, boarding houses, and tenements that catered to blacks. Mobs stripped the clothing off the white owners of these businesses. Harris also described the fraught moments during which the children were escorted to safety. In the meantime, the superintendent and matron of the asylum assembled the children and led them out to 44th Street. Miraculously, the mob refrained from assaulting the children, but when an Irish observer of the scene called out, "If there is a man among you with a heart within him, come and help these poor children," the mob laid hold of him and appeared ready to tear him to pieces. The children made their way to the 35th Street police station, where they remained for 3 days and nights before moving to the almshouse on Blackwell's Island. Ironically, the very place from which the orphanage's founders had hoped to keep black children when they built the asylum almost 30 years earlier. What made the destruction of the orphanage even more tragic was that it had only recently been completed and was a particularly nice building for its time. The report described its physical appearance. The main building was nearly 200 feet in length, 3 stories and light basement in height, with an hospital 100 feet long, 3 stories high, connected with the main building by a covered way. Several workshops were attached, and the residence of the superintendent, Mr. William Davis, was next door. The buildings were of brick and were substantial and commodious structures. A number of fine shade trees and flowering shrubs adorned the ample playgrounds and front courtyard, and a well-built fence surrounded the whole. The main buildings were burned, the trees girded by cutting with axes, the shrubs uprooted, and the fence carried away. All was destroyed except the residence of Mr. Davis, which was sacked. Conveniently, the New York Times tried to blame the racist targeting on immigrants. Some of the scenes in the side streets of the city during the day were painful in the extreme and humiliating to human nature. In the streets running north from Canal Street, where many colored people reside, mobs of foul-looking boys and men scoured up and down in the afternoon and evening in pursuit of Negroes, who were assailed wherever found. And our reporter observed in one gang several women armed with sticks rushing to and fro with a vile and cowardly crowd. But it is only justice to say that the voluble tongues of these women gave vent to their thoughts with an accentuation which was never acquired on this side of the Atlantic Ocean. It was almost impossible to look down any street in that part of the city, or any other, without seeing a crowd roving hither and thither, or standing still in heated conversation. They seemed to have no special object in view. They appeared to have had no evil-defined atrocity to perpetrate. They were rather on the lookout for something upon which to wreak their bad passions. While the mob targeted African Americans solely on the basis of race, white citizens and institutions were far from safe, especially if they were in any way associated with the government. The rioters set fire to the mayor's home as well as at least 2 police stations. Moreover, many buildings suffered more damage than they might otherwise have because the firefighters called to the scene were often in sympathy with the mob. As night approached and darkness fell, those in charge became increasingly concerned about how they would restore order. Wool later wrote, "About 9 o'clock in the evening of the same day, 13th, after this order had been issued, General Brown presented himself to me, complaining of General Sanford and strongly objecting to serve under him, asking to be excused from the operation of the order. My reply was to the effect that as General Sanford ranked him and the troops were mixed of militia, regulars, and I could not place him, General Brown, in command of all, and that for efficient operations a hearty cooperation of the state and United States troops and the police must be had for putting down the mob, protecting public and private property, and the lives of the citizens threatened. General Brown, however, persisted, notwithstanding, in urging his objections and asking to be excused. I excused him and immediately issued the following order. Colonel R. Nugent will take charge of all the regular troops, subject to the orders of Major General Sanford." Just before midnight on the 13th, Sanford sent a final message to Stanton, warning him, "The situation is not improved since dark. The program is diversified by small mobs chasing isolated Negroes as hounds would chase a fox. I mention this to indicate to you that the spirit of mob is loose, and all parts of the city pervade it. The Tribune office has been attacked by a reconnoitering party and partially sacked. A strong body of police repulsed the assailants, but another attack in force is threatened. The Telegraph is especially sought for destruction. One office has been burned by the rioters, and several others compelled to close. The main office is shut, and the business transferred to Jersey City. In brief, the city of New York is tonight at the mercy of a mob, whether organized or improvised. I am unable to say. As far as I can learn, the firemen and military companies sympathize too closely with the draft resistance movement to be relied upon for the extinguishment of fires or the restoration of order. It is to be hoped that tomorrow will be opened upon a brighter prospect than is promised tonight." There were a number of people killed that first day, including Peter Houston, whom one report described as 63 years of age, a Mohawk Indian with dark complexion and straight black hair, who has for several years been a resident of the city at the corner of Roosevelt and Oak Streets, and who has obtained a livelihood as a laborer. The report noted other tragic aspects about Houston's story. His wife died about 3 weeks before the riots, leaving with her husband and only child, a little girl named Lavinia, aged 8 years. Houston served with the New York Volunteers in the Mexican War, and has always been loyal to our government. He was brutally attacked on the 13th of July by a gang of ruffians who evidently thought him to be of the African race because of his dark complexion. He died within 4 days at Bellevue Hospital from his injuries. At the end of the Mexican War, Houston received a land warrant from the government, which enabled him to settle on a tract of land at the west, where he lived but a short time previous to his coming to this city. Chapter 3. Facts and Incidents of the Riot. Facts and Incidents of the Riot. The murder of colored people in Thompson and Sullivan Streets. The sacking of buildings in Avenues B and A. A colored man beaten to death in Leroy Street. The rioters in the 7th Precinct. Doings of Governor Seymour. The draft. The gas houses. The riot in the 10th Precinct. The plundering of stores in the 11th Precinct. Another station house burned. Other outrages. The body of Colonel O'Brien. Warehouses guarded. Some of the killed and wounded. Policemen shot. The riot at Harlem. Riotous demonstrations on Staten Island. At Yorkville, a word for our firemen. The night of the 13th brought rain and hope to those fighting fires in crowds, and for a time it seemed the cool, falling water calmed both, but daybreak Tuesday saw the violence return. One report told the disturbing story of what became of a man who tried to defend himself early on the 14th. James Costello, 97 West 33rd Street, killed on Tuesday morning, July 14th. Costello was a shoemaker, an active man in his business, industrious and sober. He went out early in the morning upon an errand, was accosted, and finally was pursued by a powerful man. Lai ran down the street, endeavored to make his escape, was nearly overtaken by his pursuer in self-defense. He turned and shot the rider with a revolver. The shot proved to be mortal. He died 2 days after. Costello was immediately set upon by the mob. They first mangled his body, then hanged it. They then cut down his body and dragged it through the gutters, smashing it with stones, and finally burnt it. The mob then attempted to kill Mrs. Costello and her children, but she escaped by climbing fences and taking refuge in a police station house. Mrs. Costello is a Christian woman and has 3 or 4 children. Meantime, a woman told the mob that a row of tenement houses in the rear were occupied by colored people, when the ringleader, armed with a cudgel, entered the place in search of the inmates, but they had effected their escape, having been apprised of their danger by some friendly neighbors at the commencement of the outbreak. Incensed at the escape of their prey, the mob burned the buildings. Upon the arrival of the police, the rioters fled. Hoping to calm the mob by the force of his personality, Horatio Seymour, the governor of New York, traveled to the New York City Hall that Tuesday and spoke before a large crowd, assuring them that, in his mind, the Conscription Act was unconstitutional and therefore could not be enforced. Seymour also noted in a letter that he hoped would be circulated that New York City didn't need a draft because there were enough volunteers. My dear sir, I have received your note about the draft. On Saturday last, I sent my adjutant general to Washington for the purpose of urging a suspension of the draft, for I know that the city of New York can furnish its full quota by volunteering. I have received a dispatch from General Sprague that the draft is suspended. There is no doubt that the conscription is postponed. I learned this from a number of sources. If I get any information of a change of policy at Washington, I will let you know. However, his words fell on deaf ears, as the mob by this time had taken on a life of its own. Meanwhile, Wool was still trying to get the situation under control. As he recalled, the following morning, July 14th, about 8 o'clock, after myself and staff had been up all night, receiving and posting the troops, General Brown again presented himself and asked to be restored to the position he had relinquished the evening before, saying in substance that he considered himself wrong in having refused to serve under General Sanford, and that, if he could be restored, he would be willing to serve as ordered. I immediately granted his request, and General Brown soon after resumed his place at the police headquarters, Colonel Nugent being directed to serve under the orders of General Brown, but not to be relieved from duty, and I issued the following order. It is reported that the rioters have already recommenced their work of destruction. Today there must be no child's play. Some of the troops under your command should be sent immediately to attack and stop those who have commenced their infernal rascality in Yorkville and Harlem. Notwithstanding General Brown's expressed willingness, in case of being restored, to serve in accordance with my orders, I regret being obliged to state that he afterward evinced no disposition to serve under General Sanford, but actually issued orders to troops stationed at the latter's headquarters without any reference whatever to General Sanford, which, however, were countermanded by the latter. After this, Brevet Brigadier General Brown continued to act under the foregoing and other written or verbal orders, which were communicated from me to him until Friday morning, 17th instant, when, by virtue of an order from the War Department, he was relieved by Brigadier General Canby, U.S. Volunteers, of all the command he had previously exercised under my orders. Wool had a difficult task and a long day ahead of him, as can be seen by the messages he sent to those near and far pleading for help. To the Inspector General of New York, he wrote, "An application has been made for a force to protect the state arsenal at Brooklyn. It is suggested that you detail 25 men with 20 rounds from the Brooklyn Regiment and order them to report at once to James McLean, military storekeeper of said arsenal, who is represented by the commanding general of ordnance as capable, with that force, to defend the arsenal." Wool also sent for help to Captain Stephen G. Sloyder, the commander of the U.S. gunboat Tulip, then moored off the end of Wall Street, giving him the shocking news that he could be called upon to fire on the city he was sworn to protect. In accordance with arrangements between you and Mr. John J. Cisco, the assistant treasurer, you are authorized to open on Wall or Pine Street, or both, if signaled accordingly. Fortunately, the situation never became so desperate as to warrant that action, but by the afternoon both Yorkville and Harlem were ablaze, and Wool had to cable the governors of nearby Massachusetts and Connecticut, pleading for them to send help to put down the violence. Fry joined his pleas to those of Wool, writing to Secretary of War Stanton, "The enforcement of the draft was yesterday seriously resisted in the 9th District of the city of New York. The mob, variously estimated in numbers as high as 30,000, attacked the officers of this bureau in the performance of their duty, and destroyed the building in which the draft had been conducted, and many of the rolls, records, and appurtenances connected with the draft. The military and the police force of the city on duty there were overwhelmed and dispersed. In the present condition of things, I do not think the draft can be made without additional force. I therefore recommend that 4 regiments of infantry and a battery of artillery be sent immediately to New York City, and, without intending to travel beyond the line of my duty, I would state that I think the public interest, so far as my department is concerned, would be greatly promoted if Major General McDowell can be assigned to such command as will enable him to direct the military operations necessary to enforce the draft in the state of New York and New England. The numbers and importance in this riot are doubtless greatly exaggerated, but I deem it sufficiently serious to justify the suggestions herein made. Years later, Martha Perry remembered Tuesday as being fearful, adding, "Men, both colored and white, were murdered within 2 blocks of us, some being hung to the nearest lamppost, and others shot. An Army officer was walking in the street near our house when a rioter was seen to kneel on the sidewalk, take aim, fire, and kill him, then coolly start on his way unmolested. I saw the 3rd Avenue streetcar rails torn up by the mob. Throughout the day, there were frequent conflicts between the military and the rioters, in which the latter were often victorious, being partially organized and well armed with various weapons taken from the stores they had plundered. I passed the hours of that dreadful night listening to the bedlam about us, to the drunken yells and coarse laughter of the rioters wandering aimlessly through the streets, and to the shouts of a mob plundering houses a block away." Fry was concerned about the safety of the man in his office and decided to use his initiative to try to quell some of the anger that was causing the violence. On Tuesday morning, he ordered Colonel Robert Nugent, the acting Assistant Provost Marshal General for New York City, to suspend the draft in New York City and Brooklyn, and to send forward the consolidated list of your districts made for this office as far as completed. Those that are not completed must be removed to a place of safety and then completed. Fry soon learned that he was nearly too late, for John Duffy, the Provost Marshal for the 5th District of New York, cabled him some dreaded news. Headquarters destroyed by the mob. Papers safe. This news led Fry to order Nugent, "Set your detectives at work to ascertain the names of the ringleaders and other principal men concerned in the late riot, and to get evidence against them so that they may be arrested and tried." Still, his conciliatory decision did dampen some of the ardor of the less dedicated rioters. While Wool and Fry were trying to get a handle on the situation in New York, Stanton was in Washington, desperate to know if he was about to have to fight the war on yet another front, and even contemplated whether New York City was in danger of joining forces with the Confederacy. While the Union Army had the troops needed to put down such a rebellion, the effect on the nation's morale could be disastrous. Throughout the day on Tuesday, he was in constant communication with Sanford in New York. "Stanton, your telegram of 9:30 just received. Please report to me immediately, first, whether any and what military force has been called out or employed by the city authorities or the drafting officers. Second, what amount of injury has been done, so far as you know, to persons and to property. Third, what measures, if any, have been taken by military or police authority to quell the riot." Sanford, it was impossible to answer your questions fully. I gave you such information as I could get at headquarters. Several conflicts have taken place today, with more serious results than those of yesterday, which were principally confined on the side of the police to severe injuries. 3 arsenals were attacked today by the rioters. At 2 points they were repulsed. At the 3rd they were successful and obtained possession of the arms, which were recaptured by the Marines and regulars. This morning nearly all the manufactories were visited by delegations from the rioters, who compelled the men to stop work. This adds to the number and somewhat to the strength of the mob. The mayor has turned over his power and forces to Governor Seymour, who is about issuing a proclamation. Have sent to headquarters for statement of facts, as far as known, and will forward immediately upon reception. An immense crowd has gathered around the evening post office since I commenced this message. As yet they are undemonstrative. General Wool's message has arrived, but gives no further information. Will try my own resources. My opinion is that 1 good regiment of native-born troops, well commanded, arriving here by 12 o'clock tonight, would save the SA office, sub-treasury, and other government property. Sanford, 12:30 p.m. Has seen General Wool. All the military which he can reach has been called for, but it now numbers only about 800 troops. These are aided by nearly 2,000 police. Governor Seymour has arrived, and General Wool reports him as cooperating heartily. He has called out several regiments, and General Wool has sent to New Jersey for 2 regiments. But, as far as I can see, the means of defense are entirely inadequate to control the present force of rioters. The military had a collision with the mob in 34th Street an hour ago and used ball cartridge. Result not reported. The rioters are now, 12 o'clock, in possession of Mayor Opdyke's house and destroying it. The chances appear to me to be against the immediate restoration of order in the city of New York. Will keep you advised of situation. By mid-afternoon, Sanford had begun to hear rumors about riots breaking out in other parts of the country, leading him to become concerned about the entire future of the nation. That thought changed the tone with which he wrote. Sanford, 4:30 p.m. You may judge of the capacity at headquarters here when every effort cannot extract any more information than I have forwarded. Excuse me for saying that this mob is testing the government nearly as strongly as the Southern Rebellion. If you cannot enforce the draft here, it will not be enforced elsewhere. The example will prove contagious, and similar events transpire in every large city. If you send sufficient force here to demonstrate the power of the government, its effect will reach every part of the country, and one settlement answer for the whole. Immediate action is necessary, or the government and country will be disgraced. Stanton, 5:10 p.m. The government will be able to stand the test, even if there should be a riot and mob in every ward of every city. The retreat of Lee's army, now in a rout and utterly broken, will leave an ample force at the disposal of the government. Sanford, 8:40. We are expecting momentarily that our southern wires will be cut, as the rioters are at work in their immediate neighborhood. It seems very important for the United States government to define its position immediately in this city, and if not done immediately, the opportunity will be lost. Governor Seymour has been sent for to come here immediately, and he is on his way. The police so far report themselves as having been successful in every fight, of which they have had many, but they say they are exhausted and cannot much longer sustain the unequal contest. Not less than 10,000 good native soldiers ought to be here this moment to restore and enforce order. While the violence on Monday was ostensibly in response to the draft, much of the violence on Tuesday simply consisted of opportunistic rioters looting stores. The New York Times offered a number of anecdotes in its report. Plunder seems to have been the sole object with the marauders in their attack upon the stores of the Messengers Brooks. The fine ready-made clothing therein was tempting. Fortunately, the police and the employees of the establishment successfully repelled the invaders before much property had been stolen. 3 or 4 persons, whose names could not be ascertained, lost their lives at this place, and many others were badly injured. An unoffending citizen named Van R. Fitch was quietly walking through Warren Street about 10 o'clock on Tuesday night, when he was knocked down and beaten in a shocking manner by some unknown parties. After the infliction of this outrage, they left the man in the middle of the street, evidently believing him to be dead, and made good their escape. Mr. Fitch was picked up by some citizens and taken to a neighboring drugstore, where his wounds were dressed. He was afterwards conveyed to his residence in 11th Street in a dying condition. At a late hour on Tuesday night, the mob made an attack upon the tenement houses, occupied by colored people, in Sullivan and Thompson Streets. For 3 hours, and up to 2 o'clock yesterday morning, there was what may be truly said to be a reign of terror throughout all that portion of the city. Several buildings were fired, and a large number of colored persons were beaten so badly that they lay insensible in the street for hours after. 2 colored children at number 59 Thompson Street were shot and instantly killed. Men, women, and children, in large numbers, flocked to the 8th Precinct Station House for protection. Over 100 of them were there accommodated with temporary shelter. Late in the afternoon of Tuesday, the hardware store of Aaron Haxter, situated at number 78 Avenue B, was attacked by the rioters. The front doors were burst open, the windows of the building were all smashed with stones and brickbats, and all the goods and valuables were taken away. The store was completely stripped, nothing of value being left. From this place, the mob repaired to the lock and gunsmith store of John Wagner, number 65 Avenue A. This was also broken open, sacked, and robbed of the contest, and afterward the property was distributed among the rioters. Late Tuesday night, the tailoring establishment of Thomas Egan on Avenue A was forced open by the mob. The doors and windows were all destroyed, and the place completely stripped of its contents. The same day, the rioters attacked the New York Times office, but they quickly realized they had made a mistake when the workers inside defended themselves with Gatling guns. The newspaper blamed various street gangs for the attack, reporting, "The partial illumination of the Times building on Tuesday night had the intended effect of annoying the thieves and assassins whose deeds alone befit the darkness. Last night, therefore, for the especial benefit of the mobocracy, the illumination was repeated, but on a more extensive and splendid scale. Our front on Printing House Square not only cast bright rays far out toward Chatham and Center Streets, eliciting the admiration of all good citizens, but on the Park Row side also the immense flaming eagle, holding the fiery scroll of Union, gazed fixedly at the blazing arch of light above, that figured in jets of gold the name of the New York Times. Seen from Broadway through the softening foliage of the trees in the park, the illumination was charming enough to all who saw it, save to the scoundrels but for whose threats it would not have been made. The scoundrels and roughs, the blood tubs and plug uglies of Baltimore, and the Scubblekill Rangers and other rowdies of Philadelphia are reported to have come to the city in large numbers to make common cause with the Dead Rabbits, Mackervillers, and other leading spirits of the riot in their work of carnage and plunder. The scoundrels cannot afford to miss this golden opportunity of indulging their brutal natures, and at the same time serving their colleagues, the Copperheads and sympathizers. Throughout Tuesday, black people were frequently targeted for no particular reason yet again. Leslie Harris described some of the worst violence inflicted upon blacks. Black men and black women were attacked, but the rioters singled out the men for special violence. On the waterfront, they hanged William Jones and then burned his body. White dock workers also beat and nearly drowned Charles Jackson, and they beat Jeremiah Robinson to death and threw his body in the river. Rioters also made a sport of mutilating the black men's bodies, sometimes sexually. A group of white men and boys mortally attacked black sailor William Williams, jumping on his chest, plunging a knife into him, smashing his body with stones, while a crowd of men, women, and children watched. None intervened, and when the mob was done with Williams, they cheered, pledging vengeance on every nigger in New York. A white laborer, George Glass, rousted black coachman Abraham Franklin from his apartment and dragged him through the streets. A crowd gathered and hanged Franklin from a lamppost as they cheered for Jefferson Davis, the Confederate president. After the mob pulled Franklin's body from the lamppost, a 16-year-old Irishman, Patrick Butler, dragged the body through the streets by its genitals. Black men who tried to defend themselves fared no better. The crowds were pitiless. After James Costello shot at and fled from a white attacker, 6 white men beat, stomped, kicked, and stoned him before hanging him from a lamppost. Chapter 4. Schemes of Plunder. The mob has made several demonstrations upon the gas houses which they seem very anxious to destroy in order that they may the better carry out their schemes of plunder and recover the universal darkness that would follow such a catastrophe. Frequent threats were made yesterday that they should be burned last night, but the authorities early saw the importance of securing the safety of these establishments, and ample preparations have been made to repel any force that can be brought to bear against them. Still, the riot has not been without serious effect in reference to the supply of gas, owing to large numbers of the workmen employed in the gas houses, under the influence of threats from the rioters or from some other cause leaving their post. The New York Times, July 16, 1863. The weather cooled after the sunset on Tuesday evening, and with it some of the mob's tempers. Wool later recorded, "It is proper to remark that the cavalry on Wednesday morning dispersed the mob with howitzers in West 32nd Street, when 28 of the rioters were known to be killed, besides the wounded. Colonel Mott lost 7 killed and 20 wounded. In the evening, the buildings in the neighborhood of Gramercy Park were reported to be in danger, and I ordered the cavalry to that place, supported by Captain Putnam, 12th U.S. Infantry, and Captain Browning. Captain Putnam, with his company having arrived at the scene of action, was fired upon by the mob when he entered the houses in search of rioters, killed many of them, and arrested many of the ringleaders. Having driven the rioters out of their houses, he pursued them up the avenue and finally dispersed them in all directions. The mob did not again assemble, and there was no more fighting after Captain Putnam's gallant action." By this point, Governor Seymour had all but conceded that private citizens would have to protect themselves on the 15th. In its report dated July 16th, the New York Times explained, "Governor Seymour has established his headquarters at the St. Nicholas Hotel, where General Wool resides, and he spent most of the day yesterday in consultation with the general and with the city authorities as to the speediest mode of restoring the public peace. He feels confident that the mob has no organization and regards to them as roving lands of lawless desperadoes bent on plunder. He is anxious that the people should follow the instructions set forth in his proclamation of Tuesday and organize themselves into armed squads in their respective neighborhoods to protect their property and the peace of the city." The Times also described some of the defensive efforts put up across the city. "Yesterday morning, the post office in this city was threatened, but ample means have been taken to protect. It is strongly garrisoned and is supplied with a heavy armament." A strong detachment under Captain Wilkes, acting under orders of Brigadier General Brown, were yesterday morning sent to protect the 42nd Street gas house. Everything in that neighborhood is considered safe. Yesterday morning, a strong mob assembled in front of the residence of Judge White, of the Superior Court of this city, and commenced demonstrations of a lawless character. The judge put out his flag, which the mob ordered him to pull in again. This was refused, and as a consequence, several windows were broken. The crowd, however, were finally arrested by the police. It is now ascertained that the body of Colonel O'Brien is at the Deed House. His murderers, after beating him in the most merciless manner with stones, bars of iron, bludgeons, and slingshots, stabbed him in several parts of his body and then dragged him through the gutters by a cord around his neck, then threw him into an areaway and stood guard over him. His body was at length removed and conveyed by 2 priests to the dead house at Bellevue Hospital. Nearly 100 colored persons sought refuge in this station from the infuriated mob. Despite every precaution taken, Wool's attempts to quell the remaining disturbances were sometimes hindered by the lack of cooperation among those he had to work with. Commanders who had survived bloody battles with their men were reluctant to turn them over to someone they did not know, leading Wool to try to reassure Colonel Ashby, "If you can send 25 men to number 32 31st Street to protect Mr. Brooks' house, I will not only approve of it, but advise it, taking care not unnecessarily to expose the men." Wool also told Brevet Brigadier General Harvey Brown, "Lieutenant Colonel Lewis Shermer, who hands you this, will report to you with 4 pieces of artillery and about 200 men, including artillery and muskets. This will supersede the necessity for calling on General Sanford for state artillery, which would not be delivered without the approval of the governor of the state. You will send, with as little delay as practicable, a section of the battery I send you this morning to the park in front of the city hall, with instructions to the infantry stationed there to aid and assist in preserving order and keep the crowd out from the park." Stanton continued to monitor the situation from Washington, with Sanford writing to him on Wednesday afternoon. "Have just returned from headquarters. Saw General Wool and Governor Seymour. The latter informed me that he had heard of organizations at Newark and Jersey City to prevent the passage of troops, and requested me to inform the 7th Regiment. I learned from Philadelphia that this regiment will not reach there till 4 o'clock, which will make it due here about tomorrow morning. There does not seem to be anyone here who is attending to these matters. Someone should superintend the transportation. If troops are to come in any numbers, all the equipments of the road should be put on the Amboy line, which can be easily guarded, and boats enough sent from here to Amboy. The troops can land from on board boats at any desired point and under cover of gunboats, if necessary. The situation does not appear to me to improve. There are indications of riotous organizations at all points from which we hear. The settling place is New York, and once determined here, all is fixed." Things may have been worse on Wednesday the 15th, but for an official notice that circulated from Nugent promising that the draft had been suspended in New York City and Brooklyn. Still, Sanford reported that evening, "The situation of affairs here is quite as critical this morning as at any former time. As far as I can learn, there has not yet been much serious fighting, but the rioters are gathered in large crowds at various points, and for the first time making their appearance downtown in the back streets. Whatever assistance is to come here should have precedence over all other railroad arrangements." Moreover, the City Council announced that it would appropriate $2.5 million to help cover the $300 exemptions for some of the city's poorest residents and thereby cover their drafting. However, for the civilians fearing for their lives and property, Wednesday might have been the worst day yet. Martha Perry described the state of affairs around her on the 15th. "I found our colored servants ghastly with terror and cautioned them to keep closely within doors. One of them told me that she had ventured out early that morning to clean the front door, and that the passing Irish, both men and women, had sworn at her so violently, saying that she and her like had caused all the trouble, that she finally rushed into the house for shelter. Now that I begin to realize our danger, I tried with all my power to keep John in ignorance of it, for in his absolutely disabled condition the situation was most distressing. The heat was intense, and during the morning I sat in his room behind closed window shutters, continually on the alert to catch every outside noise, while watching the hot street below in the glare of sunlight. Men and women passed with all sorts of valuables taken from plundered houses. Later in the day, a crowd of boys arrived with stout sticks, threw stones at our house, and then rushed on. This added to my alarm, I having heard that a rush of street Arabs always preceded an attack by the mob. Parties of Irishmen passed and pointed to our house, and a boy ran by shouting, "We'll have fun up here tonight." My heart felt overloaded as I looked at John in his helpless condition. What were we to do? Even if he were able to be moved, there was no way of accomplishing it. The rumors flying through the city were nearly as bad as the reality. Perry continued, "When one of my brothers returned to lunch and reported the increasing strength of the mob, I told him of all I had seen and heard during the morning, and we considered the question of barricading the street doors and windows, but soon decided that it was useless. He then went to the police station to ask for information and help, but before leaving placed a ladder against the back wall of our backyard, so that in case of attack the servants might, by this means, escape to the adjoining premises, and from there to the next street. The police had been already plundered of most of their firearms, and needed all their force to defend themselves. They could do literally nothing for us, but recommended barricading the front entrances to the house as well as we could. The city became frightfully still, and this silence was broken only by occasional screams and sharp reports of musketry. My brothers were calling at every house in the ward to induce the occupants to meet at the police station, armed with whatever weapon each could find, in order to organize and patrol the streets through the night. Meantime, our servants were instructed to remain downstairs, and not to run until the house was actually attacked, then to rush to the ladder in the backyard, and I was to cover their retreat by hiding the ladder. At 10 o'clock that evening we were left alone in absolute darkness, as the police sent word that light would increase our danger. John lay quietly on his cot, while I again sat by the window to catch the slightest sound. Darkness always exacerbates any sense of foreboding, and so it was that Wednesday night. Perry recounted, "During the night my brothers returned, and told us that just as the officers at the police station had agreed to combine with the citizens and patrol that vicinity, a man rushed in crying that the mob was murdering someone in our street. The whole force formed and charged up the avenue, but met only scattered bands of rioters, and these slunk away as the files of organized men appeared, stretching in solid lines from sidewalk to sidewalk, as the rioters supposed, fully armed. We heard afterward that this steadfast army, looking so formidable while so feeble in reality, was all that saved us, that our house and the one opposite, as well as the police station, were distinctly marked by the mob for that night's work." In spite of Perry's fears, nightfall actually brought an end of the worst of the violence, though it wasn't entirely clear at the time. It was only later that Wool could acknowledge the 16th was the apex of the rioting. On Wednesday evening, 16th instant, this cavalry was directed by me to patrol the disaffected districts, and by 9 o'clock that night they found, from the severe lessons the rioters had received at the hands of the police and troops, in killing and wounding many who were combined in arms and firing from buildings and corners upon the troops, and by the capture of many of their ringleaders, the riot had been effectually subdued. Chapter 5. A Reversal of Power. The rioters' actions also indicate the degree to which the sensational journalists and reformers of the 1840s and 1850s had achieved their goals of convincing whites, and particularly the Irish, that interracial socializing and marriage were evil and degrading practices. The riots unequivocally divided white workers from blacks. The act of rioting may itself have released guilt and shame over former interracial pleasures. Finally, and most simply, white workers asserted their superiority over blacks through the riots. The Civil War and the rise of the Republican Party and Lincoln to power indicated to New York's largely Democratic white workers a reversal of power in the nation. Black labor competition indicated a reversal of fortunes in New York City itself. White workers sought to remedy their upside-down world through mob violence. Leslie M. Harris, In the Shadow of Slavery, African Americans in New York City, 1626 to 1863, 2003. Fortunately, by Thursday the 16th, more and more help was arriving from outside the city. Colonel William Barons, who headed up the 65th Regiment of the New York State Nation Guard, wrote, "At 4 a.m. July 15th, I put my men on board the cars, leaving our camp and garrison equipage at Fort Washington, and arrived at the city of New York at about 5 p.m. Before leaving Fort Washington, a battery of 4 howitzers belonging to the 8th New York National Guard was attached to my command. On arriving in New York, I immediately marched my command to headquarters, reporting in person to General Wool. On the way from the dock, a large mob gathered about and attempted to get possession of 2 Negroes who were serving as cooks with the artillery company of the 8th New York National Guard. I protected them from harm by placing them amidst the battery and protecting the same by a company thrown on either flank. Upon reporting to General Wool, I was ordered to take quarters at Center Market and to report to General Harvey Brown, which I did. Pursuant to orders from General Brown, the same evening I sent 2 companies to guard the Treasury buildings on Wall Street, and 2 other companies, along with some United States troops, to restore order in the vicinity of Union Square. Barons described the action of his men that day. On the morning of the 16th of July, at 7 o'clock, I set out with my companies and the howitzers, passed through to the Hotchkiss Shell Factory on 24th Street, and left Company B, Captain L. Kretner, and one of the howitzers at that point. I then passed on with the remaining companies of my command and 2 of the howitzers for my next point of destination, Seward Shell Factory on 17th Street. While my men were passing down 17th Street, the mob gathered about in a threatening manner, but no violence was committed. At Seward Shell Factory, I stationed Company F, Lieutenant Camper Meyer commanding, with one of the howitzers. I then passed on up Avenue A with Company G, Captain Casper Rittel, and a howitzer toward Jackson Shell Factory on 28th Street, where I was to make my headquarters. On arriving at the corner of Avenue A and 22nd Street, I was fired into by the mob. I wheeled my men into line to return the fire, and the mob skedaddled. I then passed on a block farther to the corner of 23rd Street, when the mob gathered in upon my company from both directions on 23rd Street, and commenced at once to fire upon us. I returned the fire and kept up the street, firing until I arrived at 28th Street. Unfortunately, Behrens had to disperse so many of his men that he found himself in danger against the mob that morning. He explained, "Finding my small company of only 28 men, besides the men serving the howitzer, too small to disperse so large a mob as had collected, I dispatched Quartermaster Flack to headquarters on Mulberry Street for reinforcements. The mob seemed to be very generally armed. I then fought my way through the mob to the factory. One of my men was wounded, and several of the crowd were killed and wounded by our fire. On arriving at the factory, we found the door closed. I forced the door and took possession. The mob gathered heavily around the factory and fired upon us. We returned their fire, and afterwards sallied out upon them and drove them up 28th Street, as far as the corner of First Avenue, and dispersed them." By the early afternoon on Thursday, the rioters opposing Behrens' men had lost a significant amount of their furor and were ready to be more reasonable. Behrens continued, "At 2 p.m., Quartermaster R. Flack arrived with Companies A and D. At about 5 p.m., a priest came to me as a commissioner from the riotous populace and urged me to quit the factory and return, stating the people agreed that if I did so, the factory should not be injured. He stated further that the crowd threatened that if we did not leave, they would burn us out. He implored me to accept the proposal, saying that he feared the worst consequences, that the mob was about 4,000 strong, altogether too large for my weak force to resist, and that he could not control or restrain them. I reported the offer made to me by the priest to General Brown. His answer was to hold the place at all events, and to disperse the assemblage about me at the point of the bayonet, if necessary. Previous to the receipt of this response from General Brown, however, having refused the offered compromise, and the priest having retired beyond the reach of harm, and the crowd gathering heavily around the building we occupied, I found it necessary to open fire upon them, which was kept up until our assailants were driven back behind the corners of the neighboring streets." There were other problems slowing down Wool's attempts to put down the rebellion, including rumors that some of those charged with stopping the rioters might not have been fighting as hard as they could against their fellow citizens. On Thursday the 16th, Henry Stone, the Assistant Adjutant General of the Army, complained to Nugent. It is stated that the detachment of the Invalid Corps, under charge of Lieutenant Montgomery S. Reed, which was sent to quell the mob in New York, fired blank cartridges. The Provost Marshal General directs that you investigate this matter thoroughly and report whether the statement is correct, and, if so, whether Lieutenant Reed gave orders to the men under his command to fire blank cartridges. By the end of the day on Thursday the 16th, there were more than 3,000 soldiers in New York City, and though they were beginning to get a handle on the mobs, the fighting on Thursday night was fierce, even if it was not as widespread as it had been the previous evenings. As the authorities sensed they were beginning to get a handle on the riots, it appeared that the nightmare might be drawing to a close, and Wool wrote to Stanton just after 10 o'clock p.m. on the evening of the 16th. During the day, the rioters and robbers were quiet. A large number assembled near Gramercy Park this evening. They have been driven from the houses, a number of which they sacked. I think we will close the affair tomorrow. 3 regiments arrived this afternoon, and 1 yesterday, with 2 howitzers. We will probably receive 2 more tomorrow. A considerable number of rioters have been killed and wounded. We have lost 3 officers and some 28 men wounded, besides a few killed." That same day, Sanford provided similar information to Stanton. "The situation is evidently improved. Cars and omnibuses are running. The Hudson River Railroad has been relayed, and trains have come in and gone out without molestation. Laborers have resumed work at various points, and the lower part of the city presents its usual appearance. The fighting last night was quite severe. At one time the mob had the best of it, and possession of our dead and wounded, including 2 officers of the Duryea Zouaves, killed, and Colonel Edward Jardine, severely wounded. General Brown sent all the force at his disposal. He retook the position and brought off the dead and wounded. There were killed in this contest about 15 of our men and about 25 of the rioters. The mob were armed, organized, and fired at the word of command. General Brown has now, including the 7th Regiment, about 1,400 men under his command. He thinks the force for his special purposes should be increased to 3,000. It is impossible to ascertain how many troops there are here, owing to the conflict of authority under which each officer will report those belonging to himself and all the others. Yesterday, one officer received, at nearly the same time, 5 conflicting orders from as many commanders-in-chief. There is no danger of getting too many troops here of the right kind. The indications, to my mind, are that the rioters are resting and organizing. They have got arms to a considerable extent and use them pretty well. The agrarian mania has taken a stronghold of a certain class, and the cry of contrast between rich and poor is loudly raised. Every city and town that we hear from is effervescing. Philadelphia seems the most quiet, but, if once started, will be the most dangerous. I have taken care that all press dispatches which went out this morning conveyed the right impression. The strong hand tightly grasped here will be felt all over the Union. When you have given us a leader and he has 10,000 men at his command, the country will be safe. Later that evening, Sanford sent another report in which he informed Stanton, "There has been no fighting today of any consequence. The gatherings of excited people are confined at present to a small section of the upper part of the city. I anticipate a renewal of trouble tonight, both here and in Brooklyn." The next morning, Friday the 17th, Sanford offered more details about some of the fighting on the night of the 16th, but he also reported that nothing had changed overnight. The situation this morning is similar to yesterday. Business is going forward in most parts of the city. No further attack has been made on our telegraph wires, and we are in connection with Boston. The rioters made a harder fight last night than at any previous time, but were thoroughly whipped. Police Commissioner Thomas C. Acton reports that in a fight last night near Gramercy Park, the soldiers got the worst of it and were driven back, leaving one of their number killed. Captain Putnam, of the regulars, started with 2 companies and thoroughly routed the rioters, killing from 15 to 25, taking 16 prisoners, and bringing off the body of the sergeant, which was left at the first fight. Police Commissioner Acton desires to make a special request for the promotion of Captain Putnam, Company F, 12th U.S. Infantry, this being the second time that he has encountered and overcome the rioters after they had gotten the better of our troops under other officers. No disturbance has occurred this morning in any part of the city. Friday afternoon, Sanford provided another status update. Up to this hour, the city continues very quiet. The following is a synopsis of the remarks by Archbishop Hughes up to 2:45 p.m. "I do not address you as the President, nor as a military commander, nor as the mayor, but as your father. You know that for years back I have been your friend. I have stood by you with my voice and with my pen. Now, as to the causes of this unhappy excitement. Some of your grievances I know are imaginary ones, though, unfortunately, many are real. Yet know of no country under the sun that has not more cause for a just complaint than we have in this. The Archbishop, who is an excellent voice, has entire control of the sympathies of the crowd of 3,000 or 4,000 people." For his part, Fry was sending reports to the General-in-Chief of the U.S. Armies, Major General Henry Halleck. On Friday morning, he told Halleck, "I think we shall put down the riot in this city in the course of this day. We had a brush with them last fight, and they were dispersed. In searching their houses, we found 70 carbines, revolvers, and barrels of paving stones. The numbers of the rioters are very great, but scattered about in different parts of the city, where they plunder houses whenever the opportunity offers, in the absence of troops. The several regiments which arrived yesterday afternoon and evening will, I trust, enable us to crush all these parties in the course of this day." Later in the day, Fry wrote to Stanton, "Quiet and order prevailed in this city yesterday, last night, and this morning, and continues up to the present hour, 2 p.m. The rioters, it would appear, have generally returned to their ordinary occupations, and it is thought by those who seem to be best acquainted with the temper and feelings of the rioters that they will not again disturb the peace and quiet of the city, unless the enforcement of the draft, temporarily suspended, should cause another effort to resist its execution, followed by burning and otherwise destroying the property of the city, and this example would, no doubt, be followed in the adjoining counties of the state. This gratifying result has been attained by unceasing efforts, night and day, with a very moderate force at command when the emergency arose. I have received this morning from the War Department the order relieving me from the command of this department, and shall have great pleasure in turning over the command to Major General Dix, with peace and order restored in this city. as my efforts have been unceasing and continual for more than 2 years past in aiding to suppress the rebellion, I would respectfully ask of the department at this time to be ordered to Troy, there to await orders, and for the purpose of preparing a detailed report of my proceedings while in command here, with the privilege of being accompanied with a portion of my staff. By the end of Friday night, Wool was able to report with pride. During the night of the 16th and 17th, I ordered a reconnaissance of the infected district to prevent effectually the reassembling of many of the rioters, in the course of which were found under a heap of manure and under beds some 60 new breech-loading carbines and 10 revolvers, as reported. Thus ended the riot, and we have had no trouble or difficulty since. While there was never a clear-cut number recorded of the dead and injured during the riots, it seems quite certain that more than 100 people, perhaps as many as 120, lost their lives. It's likely that over 1,000 were injured, and a number of buildings were also lost to fire, including 2 churches. Ultimately, it was the orphanage that elicited the most sympathy. Before the week was out, a committee of merchants for the relief of colored people suffering from the late riots in the city of New York was organized. It later reported, "The meeting was called on the suggestion of several gentlemen in Front Street, at a very short notice, to consider the destitute condition of the colored people of this city, who have been deprived of their homes and their little property by a mob during the past week, to devise means to relieve their immediate wants, and to secure them in their peaceable and honest labor hereafter. I have been 41 years a merchant in my present location. During this period I have seen a noble race of merchants pass away. I cannot help calling to mind the many acts of charity which they performed during their lives. I hardly need to name them. You all know them. I trust we shall be quick to continue these acts of humanity, thus showing that the race of New York merchants is not deteriorating. We are now called upon to sympathize with a different class of our fellow men. It is our duty to see that they are protected in their lawful labors, to save themselves from becoming dependent on the charity of the city. We have not come together to devise means for their relief because they are colored people, but because they are, as a class, persecuted and in distress at the present moment. It is not necessary for our present purposes to inquire who the men are who have persecuted, robbed, and murdered them. We know they are bad men, who have not done as they would be done by. Let us not follow their example. Let us be quick to relieve those who are now in trouble, and should we ever find those who have persecuted the Negroes in like trouble, let us be quick to relieve them also, and thus obey the injunction of our divine Master, "Bless those who persecute you." The committee did its work well and quickly. By the end of the year, it reported that the total amount received to date is $40,779, that no special appeals were necessary to urge subscriptions, and consequently no commissions were paid to collectors. Of this amount, $27,795.56 has already been expended. The balance, $12,983.52, which the committee have on hand, they expect to use in protecting those who have lost their property in the late riots, in the prosecuting of their claims against the city, in providing for the widows, orphans, and other dependent members of the families of those who were killed, and in such other ways as they may find will do the most good. In spite of these sympathetic efforts on behalf of some of the citizens of New York, most members of the African American community were uncomfortable remaining in a city where they had been so badly mistreated. Over the next 2 years, many of the black residents who could left New York City for other places, and many of those who did stay banded together in their own enclave, giving rise to Harlem as the new haven of black culture in America. All of this resulted in a segregated society that would remain in place for decades. Leslie Harris noted, "Ironically, the most well-known center of black and interracial social life, the 5 Points, was relatively quiet during the riots. Mobs neither attacked the brothels there nor killed black people within its borders. There were also instances of interracial cooperation. But such incidents were few compared to the widespread hatred of blacks expressed during and after the riots. In all, rioters lynched 11 black men over the 5 days of mayhem. The riots forced hundreds of blacks out of the city. During the riots, landlords drove blacks from their residences, fearing the destruction of their property. After the riots, when the colored orphan asylum attempted to rebuild on the site of its old building, neighboring property owners asked them to leave. Black families also fled the city altogether. Albro Lyons, keeper of the colored sailors' home, was able to protect the boarding house on the first day of the riots, but soon fled to the neighborhood police station to seek an escort from the city for his wife and family. An officer accompanied the Lyons family to the sailors' home, where they gathered up what belongings they could carry before boarding the Roosevelt Street ferry, which took them to Williamsburg in Brooklyn. From the moment they put foot on the boat, that was the last time they ever resided in New York City, leaving it forever. Other blacks fled to New Jersey and beyond. By 1865, the black population had plummeted to just under 10,000, its lowest since 1820. As for the draft, the government tried again to implement conscription in New York City on August 19, 1863. It took 10 days to complete and went off without an incident, primarily because so few were actually called into service. Fewer than 45,000 nationwide were drafted. Of course, it did not hurt that a number of federal troops were in place long before the first name was drawn. This has been the New York City Draft Riots of 1863, the history of the notorious insurrection at the height of the Civil War. Written by Charles River editors. Narrated by Scott Clem. Copyright 2016 by Charles River editors. Production copyright 2017 by Charles River editors.
Audible hopes you have enjoyed this program.